subjects. And so what better way to spend Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day than by talking about Pearl Harbor, its history, and what you can see, and more importantly, what you can't see during your average visit to the Hawaiian Islands. Jennifer may have already mentioned to you that Jennifer's company, Compass Travel, provides, if you ever want to go and visit the Hawaiian Islands, she's happy to help, and if you ever want to cruise the Hawaiian Islands, Norwegian Cruise Lines provides some, it provides the only cruise service.
Yeah, and so you might be wondering, the question was, like, what's the connection between Norwegian Cruise Line and the Hawaiian Islands? Well, they're the only cruise line that exclusively sails in the Hawaiian Islands, and that's because of, I forget the name of the law, always, but there's this old U.S. law where if a ship doesn't call on an international port and only sails in the U.S., it has to meet a lot of certain regulations that are very expensive and difficult to do. So Norwegian is the only one that does this. So a lot of people like to combine a Hawaiian cruise with some Pearl Harbor and historical visits and things like that too. So, yeah.
I didn't want to dive into it, but when I noticed this map for Norwegian, they call it Kauai WWII, and there's a fascinating World War II connection with that harbor, and that is that the Japanese submarine I-17 surfaced and briefly shelled WWII on the night of December 7th, so 84 years ago tonight. That submarine briefly brought WWII under fire. There are several other interesting details about Hawaii's history as it related to the Second World War, even to include the December 7th attack, but that's another island for another subject, for another day, I believe. But Norwegian does at least provide service across the Hawaiian archipelago, which is why they're worth looking into if you ever want to cruise the area. And if you ever need help planning a vacation to the Hawaiian Islands, Jennifer's company, Compass Travel, is here to provide that help. Now, on to the good part. You've seen the photos before, and you don't really need me to tell you what happened 84 years ago today. But rather than narrate the events, I thought what I'd do is fill in some interesting detail. You already know how a Japanese naval task force consisting of 6 fleet aircraft carriers departed Hidokaku Bay in the north of Hokkaido. It crossed the northern Pacific and then approached the Hawaiian Islands from the north. It's interesting to me the way that certain narratives get lost in the broader picture of what happened on December 7th, and one of the narratives that I think has gotten lost is when Japanese pilots woke up that morning and went to breakfast. They were not about to board aircraft and attack Pearl Harbor. They were about to board aircraft and attack the fleet anchorage at Lahaina Roads. That's what they trained on. There was, at the time, because of President Roosevelt's decision to base the Pacific Fleet in the Hawaiian Islands, there was an argument ongoing about what represented a better anchorage, Lahaina Roads or Pearl Harbor. There are attributes, positive attributes associated with both, and then negatives associated with both. The big negative with Pearl Harbor was in the event of an emergency, it would be extremely difficult for the fleet to exit the port and move into action. Pearl Harbor provided a greater level of protection. In other words, the fleet felt safer at Pearl Harbor, but at Lahaina Roads, where you have a much broader protected anchorage, the fleet could disperse more effectively. And one of the things that we see occurring on December 7th, of course, is that the concentration of the fleet in a very small anchorage, an anchorage that actually is much too small for the Pacific Fleet, that concentration made it slightly easier for the Japanese to hit targets of opportunity over the course of both the first and the second waves of the attack. I find that the Lahaina Roads narrative of December 7th is completely lost in the way that we remember what happened on December 7th. There's a critical detail that if you watch the popular content about this, like the movie Tora Tora Tora, you get a little suggestion of what happened, and that is that not at dawn, but before dawn, and just after 5 a.m., two Jake float planes from the Japanese cruisers Chitose and Tone, they both took off, ranging ahead of the fleet, ranging ahead of the air raid, to fly down to Lahaina Roads and to Pearl Harbor to confirm not just weather, but also where the heck the fleet is. because at the point when the Japanese departed Itokapo Bay on November 26th, that fleet was sailing in the blind across the Pacific Ocean, not receiving any intelligence updates. And also, the situation about Japanese intelligence in the Hawaiian Islands was getting more and more complicated. Famously, a spy by the name of Takeo Yoshikawa was physically present on Oahu near the harbor and was getting out a lot of useful information. But in the months leading up, after he was the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet at this point, his husband Kimmel takes command in February of 41, and between the months of February and December, the fleet is about 50% of the time at Lahaina Roads. So when the Japanese wake up that morning, they don't actually know where they're going. They had gambled that in all likelihood, the fleet would be here. So when they woke up and they went to breakfast, they got the news that we are having to go to the Plan B operation, which was the attack on Pearl Harbor itself. They had trained for that, but they felt that the greater likelihood was Lahaina Roads, and so they were vastly more comfortable with the training that they had done for an attack on this anchorage. And then at the last minute, they get swapped over to the secondary anchorage, and this partly explains why the Japanese attack is such a god-awful mess. The Japanese attack is often being presented to us, served to us, as having been something that was expertly executed. And it was not. It was a big, god-awful mess, and it was because of this last-minute target change. More on that in a second. You know what happens there, and that is, of course, Tone's float plane, jet float plane flies to Lahaina Roads, nobody home. Chitose's float plane confirms the presence of the fleet at Pearl Harbor, and so the aviators immediately shift over to this Plan B that they had been training for. And the process of launching, these are a bunch of never before published photos of the fleet during the crossing and then on the morning of. Some of these photos you may have seen before, but many of them possibly new to you. At any rate, you know what happens next, and that is that the Japanese attack in two waves, both waves constituting aircraft from all 6 aircraft carriers. First wave ends up being 352 aircraft overall. First wave consisting of 183 aircraft. The aircraft all take off, and they're supposed to move into position to carry out a perfectly coordinated, perfectly timed, simultaneous attack on all of the U.S. military installations on the island of Oahu. And I think something else that's been lost in this narrative over 84 years is that the attack wasn't just on Pearl Harbor. The attack was on bases all over Oahu. To be precise, 11 separate military installations came under attack. And I find that overwhelmingly, these are the images that we see the most. So that if the news even covers this subject, and interestingly, NBC Nightly News did a brief feature last night on its broadcast that didn't even talk about the attack at all. It was about December 7th, and it was more about a museum that's located on Fort Island now, and not a single word about the attack itself. But when you do get fed some information about the attack, you're seeing the footage you're seeing film and photographs of the attack at the harbor, and you're seeing these images of aftermath. The Japanese leaving behind destruction, aircraft destroyed, ships destroyed, and then over 2,000 Americans are killed, and we're left to clean up the debris and bury our dead in this famous photograph showing Marine Corps dead from Kaneohe Naval Air Station on the island's windward coast. So that's the basic story that you get, is that whenever there is a discussion of this sort of within the mainstream of popular culture or within the news cycle, you get a very watered down, superficial treatment that focuses on only the Navy base at Pearl Harbor, overlooking everything else that happened at all of the other installations on the island. Now, when you visit today, necessarily there's a focus on the harbor itself. That's what we remember this attack by. That's the name that we associate with this attack. And because of that, most people will, when they visit Oahu, the primary focus, historical focus of their visit, will be with a visit to the harbor itself. And so, in case you're new to Oahu, there's the island with a couple of landmarks pointing it out. And the average tourist visit will focus right there at Pearl Harbor. And they're set up to accommodate that. And I think you're probably familiar with what you see when you go to visit this location. And what you see is the Arizona Memorial. That's the heart and soul of the average tourist visit to the harbor today. And please, for the sake of full disclosure, I'm 100% all in on this, and the opportunities that I've had to visit this place. I included that photo just because I thought it looked nice, but then I took that one on 80th anniversary with the flag at half-mast, which I think looks even nicer. But when I go there, every time I step off onto this memorial, I feel like I'm not worthy to be there. When I think about the loss of over 1,000 U.S. Navy sailors and U.S. Marines when that ship exploded, especially when I stand in front of that wall. And so I'm a fan. I'm not a postmodernist that's going to question the motives of the United States for pursuing war against the Empire of Japan. But you can probably guess where I fall politically on that subject. Nevertheless, I feel like this is an appropriate beating heart, the center of everything for your historical visit. Now, the issue quickly becomes that there are plenty of other things to see on this island. And the island does not make it easy for you to see these other things. In many cases, the island makes it very difficult. There are things to see that are just a few hundred feet away from this, that unless you know how to sneak around, unless you know how to work the system, you won't see these things. Nobody's going to take you there. They have a touristic route set up because Ford Island today, where you go when you visit, you'll go out on the Ford Island. It's a military installation, so there's some controls about how you get on and off the island. You're not able to drive onto the island. You have to take a bus out to the island. And when you take the bus, you're sort of at the bus's mercy. And most people don't realize that once you're on the island, the bus will, for example, take you right here to the battleship USS Missouri, and that's great and all, but just a few hundred feet down from USS Missouri is this spot that's my favorite because it shows you this great memorial, the first memorial, our first historical marker indicating that something happened here on December 7, 1941. And then right next to it was the first memorial created by USS Arizona Veterans Association and dedicated in 1955. Now, we know a lot about the famous memorial, the one that Elvis Presley helped to finance, and the famous memorial that is beginning to show its age, and more it's having to close to deal with maintenance issues. That memorial has, quite literally, millions of people that visit it per year. This memorial, which I find is beautiful and powerful and fascinating and only a few hundred feet away, almost nobody gets to visit it because you're kind of herded along on this tourist visit of Ford Island that takes you to USS Missouri and takes you to the museum that's located there. And yet, this wonderful little spot is just waiting for you nearby. Another spot that's waiting for you nearby is on the north side of Ford Island, and that's a memorial to battleship USS Utah. And USS Utah is still sitting there, just like USS Arizona is still sitting there. Utah is a lot closer into shore because they tried to recover the ship, and as a part of a recovery attempt, they pulled the ship closer into shore. And so when you go to the USS Utah Memorial, which you can see right here, you're able to visit this beautiful, powerful memorial, and then you can see the wreckage of the ship, not just out there. Now, the loss of life on Utah is not nearly the number that you have in terms of loss of life from Arizona or from Oklahoma. In Arizona, it's 103 sailors and Marines. Oklahoma, it's at 452 sailors and Marines. USS Utah, it's 52. But still, that's a ship that was a target of the December 7th attack, and Americans lost their lives on that ship. And I think this is an incredible site to visit. Most people never see it. Most people don't even know that this memorial is there or that the ship is still there. And that's because, I get it, I understand why they have the tourist routes set up the way that they have. And that's because, you might remember it too, some of you are old enough to remember it, but the era of the popularization of visiting Hawaii, which began in the 60s, the Blue Hawaii era, and then continued into the Brady Bunch era. You remember the Brady Bunch and the Hawaii episodes? I mean, that era really drew a very large number of people to the Hawaiian Islands. And they just couldn't handle the crowds. And the crowds were very interested in seeing these sites. And so when they laid everything out, when they set everything up to accommodate visitors, they said, things up to accommodate visitors really in 2 locations, and that's at the harbor and at the Punchbowl National Cemetery in the Pacific War. More on that later. The result then is that there are plenty of other things to see on this island, and most of them are off limits. The things that are not off limits are typically on private property. Many places are very difficult to get to and get to see. Many places require military ID or some advance permission. And so the result is that if you go to Hawaii today and you want to visit sites related to the December 7th attack, they tend to shuffle you down to the harbor, out to the Arizona Memorial, out onto Ford Island to visit the battleship USS Missouri and the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum, and then they take you to Punchbowl, and that's the end of that. There's a lot more to see on the island. And in fact, what I specialize in, as it relates to December 7th, are elements of the attack that aren't directly associated with the harbor itself. Most of my work has been about Hickam Army Airfield, and Jennifer was collecting emails because we're going to send an email out after this.
Yeah, so you could sign this on your way out if you didn't already with your email address.
Yeah, because I produced this documentary. It's not long, it's 15 minutes long. I think maybe it's even 10 minutes. But it's a short documentary about what happened on December 7th at Hickam, and I'll send that out to everybody. It's available for free on YouTube. I think it's an interesting insight into what happens at Hickam, and it's the only color film footage. The documentary features the only color film footage that was recorded on December 7th. There's plenty of footage out there that was subsequently colorized, but this was the only original color film footage recorded of the December 7th attack. We'll send that out in the email after the meeting. But back to what you can see on the island. Now, back to the big picture, and I want to focus in on a couple of areas. So we're going now from the harbor all the way to the northern part of the island at Kahuku, because one of the more interesting sites, I think, at the location, you can only access it by going onto a hotel property, and it's a hotel called Turtle Bay. If anybody remembers the movie Forgetting Sarah Marshall from like 20 years ago. Yeah. It was filmed entirely in Turtle Bay. So when you go there, it's fun December 7th stuff, and also every time you turn around, you recognize things from the movie. But at Turtle Bay, they have put in a memorial to the temporary SCR-270B radar station that was located on the heights directly above where Turtle Bay is located today. This is the memorial that's put there. You will never find it. It's not marked on anything. I know the tour guides that operate in the Hawaiian Islands, and I'm surprised when I speak to most of them and I mention this memorial and they don't know where it is. So there's just not a lot going on in terms of taking people out to see this site. And it's an excellent little memorial with this beautiful text panel that the Park Service created. It's technically on Turtle Bay property, but it's technically something that you can access publicly because no company can own beaches in the Hawaiian Islands. And so the beaches are completely publicly accessible. And so they have accommodated this memorial on the Turtle Bay Resort property. And a really cool thing, but it's located near the site, not at the site. The site's on heights above Turtle Bay, which you can see in the distance there. There's nothing up there today. The only thing left up there today, right near this, you see there's an illustration of the SCR-270B. And you know the famous story, right? The 2 privates, Lockhart and Elliott, detected the Japanese first wave inbound and tracked it for over an hour before they lost the contact and ground return as the aircraft came over Oahu. And so that all that's left up there today is the SCR-270B mast sat on a concrete pad, and the concrete pad's still there. So there's really nothing to see at the site aside from a slab of concrete, but at least at Turtle Bay they provide this nice memorial. And in this way, the average tourist visit to Oahu is going to be mostly a cultural experience, and if you know where to look, you might be able to see some history as well, like you can in this case. Now, to shift back to another part of the island that I'm interested in, we're going to go now right down to the very center of Oahu, to the location of 2 active U.S. Army posts, Schofield Barracks and Wheeler Army Airfield. Now, at Schofield Barracks, which is an historic place, Schofield Barracks was built as a U.S. Army post beginning in 1935 when the United States Army decided to create an entire division to occupy the Hawaiian Islands, which I find a fascinating little insight to the geopolitical difficulties of the Pacific in the mid-1930s, and that is that the United States was already in full recognition of the fact that we will one day have experienced some sort of clash with the Japanese, and as a part of that, we need to prepare the Hawaiian Islands. The Army then began building facilities on Oahu because that's where the best harbor is. It was thought that that's where all U.S. Army forces would be headquartered, which eventually they were. And so they began building and improving airfields on Oahu. Then they also committed to building an entire Army post on the center of Oahu that could house an entire division, because imagine Oahu in 1935 when I think the island population was 120,000 people, maybe 120,000 people, 20,000 of which were Hawaiian people. And so, I mean, the population of the island now, I think, is 950,000. And so it's just massive now. And back then, just nobody was home. And so the Army chose this vacant area in what used to be farm field in the center of the island and built this facility next to an existing airfield that's still called Wheeler Army Airfield. And they built up barracks facilities so that they could then recruit an entire division. At the height of the Great Depression, there was a recruiting drive in 1937, 1938 that was specifically for what they were calling the Hawaii Division, what would eventually become the 25th Infantry Division, Tropic Lightning. And the very large number of Americans who answered that recruiting drive, they go through basic training and they get sent off to paradise. And there's a great commentary about this era of what it was like to be in 25th Division during the years and months leading up to the attack. If you get a chance to watch or read From Here to Eternity, if you know the movie or the book, great work. It's a work of fiction, but it was based on a person who was in the Hawaii Division, and he documents what life was like in those years leading up to the attack, where everything was perfect and the Japanese came and ruined everything. Well, to visit Schofield Barracks today and to go to the museum that's located there today, it's possible to do it, but it's kind of like everything on Hawaii. You can see it, but this is what you got to deal with. And that is, if you don't have military ID, you're thrown into the visitor line, and the visitor line is a full vehicle inspection, and you can be issued a pass, which I've been issued every time. Don't do this if you're in a hurry, because it's a little bit of a lengthy process to be issued the pass to drive onto the post, but once you get the pass and you drive onto the post, you can explore this beautiful slice of what life in Hawaii was like in the late 1930s. And there are a lot of interesting things to see there, to include the Tropic Lightning Museum. And that's the museum located in the old quadrangle area where you have military vehicles, you have a proper traditional museum exhibit, and you can see the old quadrangle buildings that are in the background that were built when the Hawaii Division was being formed. And you can even get sort of echoes from the past, like this spot at D Quadrangle where the 27th Infantry Regiment is now located. You can turn back time to that moment, taken at that exact location. This is my uncle, the late Glenn L. Blazel. You can kind of tell we look a little bit alike. But he was he was an Alabamian, and he volunteered for the Army in response to the pre-war recruiting drive to build the Hawaii Division. And so he was there when the attack occurred. Machine Gun Section, D Company, 27th Infantry. That's why everybody's posing like the Frito Bandito with belts and machine gun ammo across their chest. But then also an interesting thing to see on post is this cemetery. The cemetery was created as a part of the Army post, and the cemetery has this fascinating history, and nobody gets to see it unless you have a military ID and you can drive onto Schofield and you have time to kill. What makes this cemetery so fascinating is that all of the war dead from December 7th were initially buried here. So there's an area where they were initially buried. Then, eventually, does anybody know who Eddie Slovik is? If you're familiar with Private Slovik, who was shot for desertion. He was in the 28th Infantry Division, shot for desertion during the Battle of the Bulge. All of the criminals who were up on capital charges during the Second World War, who were subsequently executed, some of them were buried at a cemetery in France, and the rest of them are buried here. And it's a fascinating thing to see because they're sequestered, they're off to the side, they're not in the main burial area. They have a low hedge that's blocking them off and their graves aren't identified. They're buried by a number that corresponds to their identity. And it was because they dishonored themselves by committing capital crimes. Those crimes are all as 2 crimes and 2 crimes only, you can probably guess, murder and rape. And so there are Americans buried here who committed capital crimes in Europe, and we're still struggling to explain why some of them ended up buried in France, like Eddie Slovik was, although he was eventually brought back to the United States, and then some of them ended up at Schofield Barracks, but that's what happened. There were also a very large number of prisoners of war on Oahu during World War II. Not just Japanese, but prisoners of war from Italy and from Germany as well, that were at a camp, that the sprawling, skinny little camp that stretches all the way from practically the harbor all the way up to Schofield, called Honouliuli, and it follows this gulch that the National Park Service about 10 years ago designated a part of the preservation area for World War II. And nobody's allowed to visit it. So they built a road in, immediately closed it, and nobody gets to go there. I've never been there myself. And the fascinating thing is that Honouliuli, which was created as a prisoner of war camp, and then, you know about Executive Order 1966 and internment during the Second World War, where Americans of Japanese ancestry were interned. Well, they made a decision to exempt the Hawaiian Islands, because to intern all of the Americans of Japanese ancestry in the Hawaiian Islands would be to intern half of the population. It's estimated that it's between 42 and 45% of the population, but nearly half the island would have been subject to internment. And so they decided to exempt the Hawaiian Islands, but then there were troublemakers. And what the troublemakers were doing over the course of martial law, and just keep in mind that martial law on Hawaiian Islands begins when? 84 years ago tonight. And it continues until October of 1944. And under the circumstances of martial law, anybody that violated things, there were simple violations like out past curfew. There were violations of people that were caught counterfeiting food rationing stamps. And then there were more serious violations. And there were people who were politically and ideologically hardliners. And they end up being interned. But it's a case-by-case basis. Whereas on the U.S. West Coast, it's everyone who is of Japanese ancestry gets hauled off to one of the internment camps. In the Hawaiian Islands, case-by-case basis, they end up with 1,700 people who are, in some cases, native-born Americans of Hawaiian and Japanese ancestry. In some cases, 100% Japanese ancestry, although born on American soil. Although Hawaii was not yet a state, it was just a territory, but still American soil. But they end up with about 1,700 of them. They're interned at Honouliuli, and some of them die in the internment camp and get buried in the cemetery. And then you get weird stuff. The big weird thing is a mystery that we've been working on for years now. And I was there when the mystery was first created. And that I was friendly for a long time with the person who was the historian for USS Arizona. He's a retired park ranger named Dan Martinez. He's still alive and well, but he's just no longer active and his health is not good. Well, Dan and I were standing at the visitor center for USS Arizona, and one of the security rangers came over and said, "Hey, somebody just dropped off a photo album over there you might want to look at." And we looked at each other like, "Let's go see." And so we walked over and we started thumbing through it. The photo album said simply Eva Ranch, which is southwestern tip of Oahu. And as we're flipping through very dull, boring, and mundane photos, we eventually flipped to that photo. And the two of us looked at each other like, what in the... Because, you notice it's identified unidentified Japanese soldiers. And then, as we looked at these graves, we were like, who would they have been, and where are they, and where's the spot now? Well, after years of effort, with a lot of help from Jennifer, I figured out the spot, and it's the cemetery at Schofield Barracks. It's right outside of the main wall where they kind of completed that cemetery. The question is, are they still there? And nobody can answer that question. A strange thing happened for 80th anniversary, and it's going to be stranger for 85th, I'm sure. And that is, I grew up very interested in this subject. My uncle was there on December 7th. Couldn't get enough of it. My father was an Army officer. Every December 7th on Army posts, the Post Theater showed the movie Tora Tora Tora. It was crack cocaine to me when I was a child. I loved that movie. And so I was 100% in on this subject matter. And that kind of compelled my interest in history forward in my adulthood. And I got used to being around a lot of these older, smarter Pearl Harbor historians that really knew the subject well. And I went out there for the 75th anniversary, saw a couple of them, went out there for the 80th anniversary, and I looked around and they're all gone. All these guys who were older and smarter than me, and they're gone now. And I'm the old guy. I never saw that coming, and I never planned for that eventuality. And the reality here is that there's one person who's still alive that when he dies, which is probably going to occur soon, we know that more knowledge about this attack is going to disappear with his brain than any of us will ever have a chance to gather, because he had access to veterans. And he had not just a couple of years, of decades of access to people that were here. And he talked to everybody. His name's Michael Winger. He couldn't be a greater human being. He's very helpful to me and helped me a lot as I tried to solve this issue, solve this matter. And he has no answer for whether or not these unidentified Japanese soldiers are still there. We have theories at this point, and it's theories that are based on people that have spent decades of their lives interested in this subject. And my theory is that these were prisoners of war that were brought back from one of the Pacific Island battles. It didn't happen much. I think you're familiar with the way that the Japanese dealt with the surrender issue in Pacific battles, and that they did not do it. But we took prisoners, and we didn't take prisoners because they came out with their hands up. I know you've seen footage. You've seen footage of Pacific battles where you see men coming out with their hands up and surrendering to American soldiers and Marines. You've seen footage of that. In every case, those are not Japanese. Those are Koreans. Those are Koreans. They gave up. They gave up all the time. The Japanese would not give up. The way we captured them typically was that they got concussed or they got wounded, and we dragged them off and nursed them back to health. And then we took them to Honolulu on Oahu. And in some cases, some of them committed suicide while prisoners of war, where they didn't have a chance to kill themselves during the battle, but then they had a chance to kill themselves once they were prisoners of war. And we think that might explain this. We're not sure, though. There are other theories, but enough about that. Let's move on. Moving on to the next geographical location on Oahu to talk about commemoration. And I'm going to move us now down to the southwestern tip of the island at Barber's Point. There are fascinating things to see around Barber's Point. And the place that I like the most, it's narrating a little bit of the Marine Corps' history with December 7th. And that is, there was a functioning U.S. Marine Corps airfield called Mooring Mast Field. It's still there. It's the Barber's Point. I think it's a Coast Guard airfield now. And the old mooring mast field that the Marine Corps used on December 7th, it continued to serve all the way up into the 60s, and then they closed it down. And so it's a functionally abandoned site, which makes the story very interesting. And Eva Mooring Mast Field comes under attack by a strafing and suppression mission from the Japanese aircraft carrier that would have been Kaga on December 7th, where a flight lead named Yoshio Shiga, who goes on to be a member of the Japanese Diet after the war, Shiga and 9 other Zeros came in and strafed the place up and absolutely tore the place to pieces. It's famously that during Shiga's first strafing run at Eva, that the gate guard who was on duty that morning, who was a PFC named Melvin Thompson, he walked out of the gate to the main entrance to Eva and saw Shiga lining up for his first strafing run, and Thompson drew his .45 and opened fire on him, and Shiga mentioned it in his after-action report, which I think is one of the most interesting moments of the entire attack. Not sure what good that .45 would have done, but he at least did something. And a large number of Marines fought back. That's another thing that I believe gets lost in this narrative, is that the narrative that we keep getting served over and over again is the way that at dawn we slept, we were caught by surprise, and the enemy attacked us, and a bunch of Americans were killed. That's where much of the emphasis is. And what that overlooks is the way that the U.S. military fought back aggressively, and fought back very effectively. We fought back so aggressively and effectively that their return for this attack dropped off dramatically. I'm not sure if you've heard this quote before, but 90% of the damage of this attack occurred during the first 10 minutes. The remaining 10% occurs over the next 2 hours. And the reality here is that when the second wave appeared over Oahu, they got almost nothing done. And that's because we were more and more knocking them out of the sky. We were more and more putting up effective anti-aircraft defenses that were preventing them from connecting with targets like they were supposed to. And the point I mentioned earlier, and that is that these aviators had trained for a different mission. They had trained to carry out an attack over this big, unforgiving, this wide open space of Lahaina roads. And then when they had to shift over to the attack that they were less prepared for, they didn't do well. They didn't carry it out well. And the reality here of the death toll, I feel bad even mentioning it, because 2,306 Americans were killed that day. The reality is that almost all of them are killed in the first 2 minutes. And almost all of them are killed on what ships? We can count them on one hand. Arizona, Oklahoma, California, and Utah. That's where almost all of our casualties come from. And yes, we lose people elsewhere on the island during the attack. But if the Japanese do not get the lucky hit on Arizona that they get, the number of American casualties is cut in half. And let's face it, the hit that they get on Arizona that causes Arizona to explode, that was a 1 in a million hit that almost didn't happen. But it did. And so the body count is doubled by that. At any rate, you have a large number of Marines at EVA that fight back, like Mel Thompson, the gate guard, the Marine. You get Marines that are fighting here, and it's a fascinating detail. You see the wooden structures there, they're fighting over the pool that was being built. Because there was a recognition for the fact, there's fascinating documents that indicate that to be assigned to EVA back in the day, EVA, you're in paradise, but you're on the leeward side of paradise. The windward side of the island, the eastern side of the island is true paradise. It couldn't be more perfect. The western side of the island is a desert. And you're experiencing the desert at EVA. And so it was not fun to be posted at EVA. And the quality of life was just not there. The Army had provided this amazing facility at Schofield. The Army Air Corps, where everybody lived better than everybody else, had this amazing facility right next to the harbor. The Navy had a great facility. And the Marines are living out in this desert wasteland around plantations. And so they were going to solve that problem by putting in a swimming pool. And then they also put in a bowling alley eventually. And that was going to make all the Marines happy. And when you were assigned at EVA, you rarely got a pass to trace all the way into Honolulu, which is where the only place you could go to have fun on the island. And even if you could get a pass to go to Honolulu, you might not have fun because it was swarmed by soldiers in uniforms, sailors in uniforms, and for Marines to get all the way into town and then try to make it back to EVA in time for formation the next day wasn't easy. So they were trying to improve the quality of life at EVA by building a swimming pool. The swimming pool is still there. It's all buried. It's all completely engulfed by shrubbery now. But these Marines drew rifles, and they're returning fire with 1903 bolt-action rifles against Japanese Zeros spraying by at 300 miles an hour. And then famously, in the middle of all of this, you have a group of 12 aircraft that fly into the attack. Everybody knows about USS Enterprise, the most prolific of all U.S. Navy warships in World War II. Enterprise is 200 miles south of Oahu on the morning of December 7th, and Enterprise puts up a patrol of 12 aircraft from the ship's patrol squadron, VS-6. And those aircraft, they're all SPD Dauntless dive bombers, and they're all flying toward Oahu as the attack begins, and they're making first landfall at EVA, right at Barber's Point. And they fly right into the middle of Yoshida and his group of 9 Zeros that are destroying everything in sight. And so Shiga's Zeros jump them. And in this very well-known photograph, you see one of Shiga's Zeros and the crash site for one of the Dauntlesses from Enterprise that has just arrived. And that was Clarence Dickinson's Dauntless. Dickinson was the pilot. He bailed out. He survived. He goes on to fly at Midway. And he writes this great book, if you ever get a chance to read it. It's called The Flying Guns by Clarence Dickinson. And just to show you how quickly things happened, the attack was on December 7th, 1941. Dickinson's book, The Flying Guns, comes out in February. So it was a matter of very quickly, people were like, I'm going to get everything on paper of what I just went through and get the book out. And it was the New York Times bestseller in the United States. Very interesting book.
His gunner did not make it?
Huh?
His gunner did not
His gunner did not make it. His gunner burned in. And his remains were eventually recovered. And where were they buried? the cemetery, post cemetery at Schofield, until they were eventually moved home. That post cemetery at Schofield is an interesting place. Very few people get to see it. But that's where Dickinson's Dauntless burned in. These are Marine Corps Dauntlesses at Eva that were attacked that day. That's actually not even a Dauntless, that's the SB-2U Vought Vindicator. That's one of the Marine Corps VMS D-241 Vought Vindicators. And that's a JRS-1 transport aircraft for Marine Utility Squadron 12, I think it was. And so the Japanese they raised hell with the place, shot up the ambulance, shot up the fire truck. They tore the place to pieces, set the hangar on fire. An interesting detail here, this hangar gets heavily damaged. The hangar eventually, then all the metallic components, all the hardware associated with that hangar, it gets disassembled. It gets moved out to Ford Island. It gets reassembled, and it serves there through part of the post-war period. And then it gets disassembled again and gets moved back out to Barker's Point, where it's reassembled, and then they destroy it, making the movie Tora 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 in 1969. You know, there's a big payoff moment in Tora 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 where you see a burning Japanese airplane that comes down and crashes into a hangar. It's that hangar, only after it's moved twice. Strange point of detail there. At any rate, when you go to Eva today, Eva is no longer a functioning Marine Corps airfield. It stopped functioning in the 1960s, a long time ago. Well, what is there? What they did was the Hawaiian government, the state of Hawaii, because by now there's a state of Hawaii, when they finally give up Eva, the state of Hawaii has to make a decision about what to do with the property. And so one of the things that they decide to do with that property, they designate an area of it for affordable housing, which never really works out, surprise, surprise. And then they turn the rest of what used to be Eva Marine Corps Mooring Mast Field into a golf course. And it's still a golf course today, but it's a golf course that's only for police officers and military. So if you just walk in and you don't have police background or military background, you can't play golf there, but you can go to the clubhouse. And if you go to the clubhouse, right behind it is this lovely memorial, remembering the fact that this main stretch of fairway is the main area where the field was during the attack on December 7th. This is, strangely, it's turned into one of the more popular stops that I take people when I go there, because we do the harbor thing, which you have to do it. We do a few other things all around the island, but we'll go here, and what makes it popular is that as soon as we look at the memorial and I tell them a little bit about the battle for Eva Field, everybody goes into the club and gets a drink, which is what makes it popular. But it is a nice little memorial, also put up by the Park Service. Also, this delicate, awkward situation of it's private property and it's technically off limits unless you're police or military, but it's also National Park Service, and we can't tell you that you can't be here. And then if you go in and you buy a drink at the bar, they don't care because you've left some money there. So there are a lot of places on Oahu, the rules governing whether or not you can visit are a lot like this. It's more about what you can't see than it is about what you can see. And excellent little wayside sign, a nice memorial remembering the 4 Marines who were killed in action at Eva Mooring Mast Field 84 years ago today. And one of my favorite places to go visit. And most people don't get a chance to go there unless you go on a tour with somebody that really knows the history well and knows where to go. You would never know to go here. And then in the area around back, you know how every golf course has the maintenance shed? If you go around back to the back of the maintenance shed area, there's something fascinating to be seen back there in the form of these aircraft revetments. The aircraft revetments, they're not there on December 7th, 1941. They're built after the attack. But the aircraft revetments tell us something really interesting, and that is, in those months immediately after the attack, we were scared. We were still worried that the Japanese would be back. The Japanese came back. They just didn't come back like we thought they would. We thought that they would come back with some sort of an amphibious landing operation like the one that they threw against our outpost on Guam or our outpost on Wake. That's what we expected. It never materializes in the Hawaiian Islands, but during this period where we thought it might, we built aircraft revetments at Eva Mooring Mast Field to protect airplanes. Because, why? What happened on December 7th? Well, we had 188 aircraft that got destroyed on the ground. That's what happened. And these revetments were an investment in preventing that from happening again. The fun part is that there's now like a riding club that uses the area, and they have stables. They use the revetments as stables for the horses. And then they also use it for storage. I think that's stuff associated with the riding club. But it's still an interesting thing to see from Oahu's World War II history that you can't see unless you know somebody who's a member of the riding club who would open the gate and let you in to look at it. Also nearby, on the beach that's now called Nimitz Beach, there's this bunker that's now called the Good Vibes Only bunker because somebody painted Good Vibes Only on the side of it and the sign. But the Good Vibes Only bunker was built during the same era as the aircraft revetments at Eva. During this late 1942, maybe the very beginning of 1943 time period, when we were concerned that the Japanese might conduct an amphibious landing of some kind on Oahu. And if they were to land on Oahu, the best place for them to land would either be Waikiki Beach or Barbers Point. And so we build revetments to protect the airplanes that are living around Barbers Point, and then we build a bunker like the Good Vibes Only bunker that's still out there today. It's in rough shape, but it's still there, providing a little bit of a reminder of this moment in our history after Pearl Harbor, when we still worried that the Japanese might invade Hawaii. Those fears, they go away once and for all in 1943. And there's even some recognition that we never really needed to worry about that to begin with. But still, we spent some money building bunkers on Oahu, even though we didn't really need to. Very close by is one of my favorite sites on the entire island, and you can only access this site by paying full admission to go to one of the cheesiest tourist things on the island. And the site I'm talking about is the Barbers Point Lighthouse. And the reason I think it's such an interesting place is because there's a battle here on Monday, December 8th, 1941, that nobody's ever heard of. If you've heard about it, please excuse me for insulting your intelligence, but if it's unfamiliar to you, let me just tell you what happens. And that is, I mentioned how Yoshida and his 9 aircraft are strafing the Eva Mooring Mast Field Complex. Well, then there are other aircraft attacking in the area around Barbers Point, and it leads to a general activation of the military base around the area. Well, an aircraft that was bombing the harbor, one of the Japanese dive bombers, the Val dive bombers, that aircraft took some damage from ground fire and was flying toward the west. We think it was flying toward this island called Niihau. That's another subject all to its own. But we think the airplane was trying to make it to an emergency landing on Niihau, and that as that airplane was flying westward toward Barbers Point, it got jumped by 2 Americans. You know the story. And that is that over the course of the attack on December 7th, 8 American U.S. Army pilots took off from 2 places, and that is the auxiliary airfield on the North Shore at Haleiwa, and then Wheeler Army Airfield near Schofield Barracks. And these 8 pilots took off, went into the air, chased down Japanese airplanes, and 3 of them shot down Japanese airplanes. 2 of them wingmen together, and that's Taylor and Welch, George Taylor and John Welch. Those 2 pilots scored a number of kills that day, and one of the kills was this Japanese dive bomber that was flying over Barbers Point. Taylor and Welch closed in on him, shot him to pieces. He ditched the aircraft right offshore. In fact, the tail gunner of that aircraft was a Japanese petty officer named Michichi Utsugi. Utsugi opened fire and almost killed Welch. Welch took a bullet right through the front windscreen. He was flying the P-40 Warhawk aircraft, and that's, Bob Carr likes to say there's no such thing as bulletproof glass, which is true. There is bullet-resistant glass, and there was a big old slab of, I think, about 2 inches of glass as the front pane of the windscreen on the P-40, and he took a bullet right in the center of that, and he couldn't see anything, so he broke contact, and Taylor finished off the aircraft. The aircraft goes down in flames. It goes down 200 feet off the beach, right by the lighthouse. And when the pilot puts the airplane down, he puts it down gently enough to where the airplane remains upright. There is a lighthouse operator in the lighthouse tower. Now, the tower part has been chopped off because the lighthouse, it was automated in the 1960s. But when there was a lighthouse keeper there, back in the 1940s, He was up in the lighthouse trying to watch the air battle that was going on. Because by this point, the air battle had been going on for over an hour. So the lighthouse keeper climbed to the top of the lighthouse and was watching everything when suddenly these 2 American P-40s chased this Japanese Val dive bomber down, and the airplane ditches right in front of the lighthouse. And so the lighthouse keeper is watching as the Japanese pilot gets out of the aircraft. He drags his wounded tail gunner out of the aircraft and then drags him ashore. And he drags him ashore about 400 feet up the beach from the lighthouse. And the lighthouse keeper watches him do it through binoculars, picks up the telephone, and calls the closest number that makes sense, which is the U.S. Army Command at it's Fort Kamehameha, which is on the west side of the harbor entrance. And he tells the operator that he talks to, he's like, hey, this Japanese airplane just ditched right offshore, and I watched the pilot and the tail gunner get out of the airplane, and they just crawled up onto the beach right near the lighthouse. They told him then, all right, we'll send somebody down to check it out. The truck pulls up to the lighthouse right at sunset on December 7th. The lighthouse keeper comes down out of the lighthouse. He talks to the U.S. Army soldier. There's a young lieutenant, and he talks to the lieutenant. In a couple of minutes, he says, I watched him drag the tail gunner off right up the beach. You can even see the drag marks where he dragged him up the beach in the sand. And so this U.S. Army officer then says, all right, thanks, we're going to go check it out. They then walk down the beach. They find the spot where the pilot, his name was Jin Goto, where Goto dragged Tsugi off the beach. They follow the tracks right as the sun sets on December 7th. They stay out there all night long, and shortly after midnight, they finally find the pilot, Jin Goto, and they have a brief gun battle with him during the pre-dawn hours, maybe even right at dawn on Monday, December 8th, 1941. They kill him. They then strip him of everything. Everybody takes souvenirs off of the body of the 2 men because the tail gunner had succumbed to his wounds overnight, and the pilot got shot and killed by these U.S. Army soldiers probably close to dawn on December 8th. And so that's the Battle of Barbers Point. And I find that very few people are familiar with this battle. Proof of this battle emerged in the form of wreckage from Goto and Tsugi's aircraft that washed ashore during Hurricane Iniki in 1996. And here's the big mystery that we're still trying to work on, and that is that nobody knows what happens to the bodies. We know that the U.S. Army soldiers that killed Goto then took all the souvenirs from the dead bodies, and then they put them in what was described as a karst hole or a sinkhole, and left them there. And for all we know, they're still out there somewhere to this day. I think it's likely that they're probably still there, although they're now covered over by the golf course that was created where Evo Mori-Mass Field used to be. Well, at any rate, it's really cool to go there and imagine this little incident that occurred that's, I think, definitely a noteworthy chapter in the history of the December 7th attack, and an overlooked chapter in that. And the only way that you can access the lighthouse is if you pay a full fee to go to Germain's Luau. Because Germain's, the oldest luau on Oahu, by the way, they own the property around the lighthouse. The lighthouse is owned by the U.S. government still. But all of the property there, they have all this fencing, and they're kind of aggressive about keeping people out. And so really the only way to go there is to pull up and just go along with it, have a good time, have a Mai Tai at Germain's. There's a little aloha spot for kids for photos. But to go, and it's dorky, and it's corny, and it's ridiculous, and it's also kind of fun. And the great thing about it is that if you pay full fee to go to Germain's Luau, as corny as it sounds, you get to go out and step out onto the area where the Battle of Barbers Point occurred 84 years ago. And so this is why all of my tours end up going here, for partly because you want to have the cultural experience of a cheesy, over-the-top Don Ho type luau. You remember Don Ho? I still quote Don Ho all the time, and more I'm finding people don't know who he was. But I used to watch the Don Ho luau on TV when I was a kid. At any rate, the Germain's Luau, it's a full dining experience and a show. And it's corny, but it's fun. And it allows you to park and go out and look at Barbers Point Lighthouse and the site of the battle where Jin Goto and Michichi Utsugi got killed on December 8th. All right, let's hit one last geographical area on the island. Right here. So going back toward Honolulu itself, one of the things that almost every visit involves is what I think is probably the most appropriate place to go. I mentioned earlier at the outset of the presentation that when you go there today, you get kind of corralled into two locations, and two only. The harbor, not that there's anything wrong with going there, and then this location, Punch Bowl Cemetery. Punch Bowl Cemetery in the Pacific War was an existing cemetery where we buried a large number of war dead from World War II during World War II. There are burials that occurred there in 1942. And eventually, most of the dead were collected up from all over the island. And once again, the attack that took place 84 years ago, it is targeting not just Pearl Harbor, but it's targeting all of these other locations across Hawaii. They eventually take all of the dead that are buried, bury them initially at Schofield. They then begin this unfortunate chapter in history of, if you've read anything about what happens to the Pearl Harbor dead, is that they get buried, they get dug up, they get buried again, they get taken over by the county coroner for Oahu County. The county coroner makes a complete mess, mixing remains very often, to the extent that a large number of the December 7th killed who are buried here, they're buried in such a way that you can't differentiate between 2, 3, and in some cases 4 people, because their remains were allowed to mix by this coroner. And then they were eventually taken back to and interred here at Punch Bowl. Now, when you visit Punch Bowl today, there are a lot of fascinating people to see there, but like everything else on Oahu, it's a story of what you can and can't see. There's a weird twist to the way that people experience Punch Bowl Cemetery, and that is when you drive in, you recognize it immediately, because when you pull up, there's the cemetery burial area itself, but then also this that's called the Honolulu Memorial. And you remember Hawaii 5-0, right? And you know how it starts with a big zoom shot of the Honolulu Memorial, and it zooms right in on her face, just as as the music starts, right? And so it's a magnificent thing to see, and it even includes this big, beautiful statue that includes the quote from the Bixby letter that Lincoln wrote during the Civil War, if you know that letter, quoted in Saving Private Ryan. The Honolulu Memorial itself is maintained separately by the American Battle Monuments Commission. Punch Bowl National Cemetery is a part of our national cemetery system, so there are 2 organizations that are in charge of caring for the cemetery. The cemetery is an active place of burial, and because it's a national cemetery, you have service members who served in World War II, many who survived World War II, many who survive all the way to the current day, and they can be buried there, and their spouses and their dependents can be buried there as well. And the result is that you have a lot of people buried in Punch Bowl now, and there's an historical area, and then out to the fringes of the main burial area, you have the contemporary burials. And the result now is that for people who are interested in World War II history, it's fascinating to go up to the memorial itself, because the memorial is spectacular. And then they often like to have a look around the burial area. Well, they're conducting burials at the cemetery almost every day. So whenever you go there, there's a funeral going on, or an interment, I should say. And so the result is that they have put restrictions in place about the way that you visit, so that if you go as a tourist to Oahu and you don't rent a car, and you sign up for one of the big tour operators, like, what's the big one? Roberts of Hawaii is a big one, where they'll take you on a full bus tour of the entire island, and that means they'll take you down to the harbor and let you see the Arizona, and then they'll maybe take you up to the North Shore, they'll take you to Germain's for the luau, they'll bring you to Punch Bowl. But the restriction against them, against the commercial tour operators, is they're allowed to enter Punch Bowl Cemetery, but they're not allowed to stop. So that the buses will drive into the cemetery, and the buses, they can't stop the bus, but they can, by God, go as slow as possible as they creep around the cemetery with a tour guide up at the front of the bus on a microphone telling you stories about it. Usually it's the bus driver himself telling you stories about it. Sometimes they're even historically accurate, but not always. And one of the things that they end up doing is they end up creeping along this one stretch on the way back out, where there are burials right along the main road that they drive in on. And they creep along it because, again, they can't stop. But they'll show you the famous people. And there are several famous people that are buried there. Like, for example, Ellison Onizuka, who was an astronaut killed in the Challenger disaster. He's buried there. He's right out front, so they sort of creep by Ellison Onizuka very slowly. But if you have that experience in Punchbowl, since the bus doesn't stop, you can't get out. So you don't get to explore the Punchbowl Cemetery at all. Yes, sir?
Marty, look at there at the memorial, there were several friezes or pictures depicting major World War II battles all along the outside of the memorial.
And aren't those maps amazing? They're beautiful. Guam, Iwo Jima, Kwajalein with Roy and Namor, Tarawa, the Gilbert Islands attack. They have a really good one of the New Guinea campaign. Midway. They have Okinawa up there. They even have these frescoes that they added at the end to the memorial. One remembering the war in Korea and the other one remembering the war in Vietnam. Yeah, it's a fascinating place to go. And that's why I like to end every visit there, because you get to see amazing things like that. You get to see amazing people like people that lining the stairs that lead up to the Honolulu Memorial are what they call the tablets of the missing. And those are missing individuals like Alexander Bonnyman, who was a recipient of the Medal of Honor from the Battle of Tarawa in November '43. And that's a fascinating story if you've kept up with it, and that is that Bonnyman, despite the fact that he subsequently awarded the Medal of Honor for his action, he's killed on Tarawa during the assault on Admiral Shibasaki's bunker on the island, and he's buried in a mass grave because when the 2nd Marine Division went to Tarawa for that battle, they expected to have light casualties, maybe 100 casualties total, maybe with 50 killed. And they get 1,000 Marines killed. And the result was that the naval task force that went to the islands to carry out this attack, it didn't have enough freezer space for all the bodies. So they couldn't bring them back to Hawaii. And they couldn't leave them above ground. And so they had no recourse, but they buried them in 36 separate mass graves on the island with the thought that we're going to bury them here. This is temporary. We're coming back for them. We'll come back in a couple of months. The task force has to go back to Hawaii now. And you know why it had to rush back to Hawaii? It was running out of food and it was running out of fresh water. And so they couldn't stay. They hurriedly buried all of the 2nd Marine Division war dead. And in these mass grave sites, they went back to Hawaii, and then the results of the war, the exigencies of the war were such that they couldn't get back to take care of the war dead for 3 years. And by that point, the war was over. And by that point, the Navy had built an airfield on Tarawa. And by that point, the Navy had built airfield and adjacent facilities over all of the mass graves. And so the mass graves are basically unrecoverable. That's what they're listed as. Bonnyman's family was told that his remains are still on Tarawa and they're unrecoverable. And that is, it's one of the most chilling things I've ever seen in my life. But eventually, private associations began returning to Tarawa to locate these mass grave sites. And they eventually located mass grave number 16, which is where Bonnyman was. And they went back in 2015 to excavate that mass grave site. And the person who was in the hole uncovering human remains and uncovered his remains because he had distinctive gold fillings in his teeth. The person that brushed the sand away from Alexander Bonnyman's skull was his son. If you look it up, there's footage of it happening. It's chilling to watch. And so he's now claimed, but at the time that the Punchbowl Cemetery was established, we thought we'll never be able to recover our war dead from Tarawa. They're there forever. And we had people like that all over the width of the Pacific Ocean. And so we created the Tablets of the Missing. And Bonnyman, and if you'll notice this floret that is located here, that floret was attached to the wall next to his name in 2015 when his remains were finally discovered. Fascinating story. But you get stories like Bonnyman here on the Tablets of the Missing. You get this dude, this stud, probably the most eloquent voice of commentary on the American experience in combat in the Second World War, all theaters. It's funny if you contrast him with Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway spends most of his time going to brothels in France and stumbling from one bar to the next. And Ernie Pyle was up front from Sicily to the Liri Valley in Italy. He lands with the troops in Normandy he's photographed over and over again with our troops all the way across the war in the Mediterranean, the war in Northern Europe, and then he comes to the war in the Pacific, which eventually claims his life on April 18, 1945, on an island called Ieshima, just offshore from Okinawa. And Pyle, who was a World War I, he was writing for Scripps Howard Institute during World War II. He was a World War I Navy veteran, and so he's buried with military honors here. He's right near Elsinore-Nizuka. And so as the buses creep by, you always know what the bus driver is telling everyone. They're talking about Ernie Pyle. They're talking about Elsinore-Nizuka. And so for most people, their experience at Punch Bowl Cemetery is one in which they can't get off the bus. And if you hire on with a commercial tour operator, that's the way you're going to experience the Punch Bowl. But if you go to Oahu and you rent a car and you drive yourself up there, now you can go into a parking area and you can get out and explore. And that's where the best experience is to be had. Because when you do that and you get out of the car and you walk around among the graves in the historical area, you get to see people like this stud here. If you know the Dean Hawkins story from Tarawa, Dean Hawkins was the man commanding the Scout Sniper Platoon for 2nd Marine Regiment. Gets killed on the pier at Tarawa on the first day. A fascinating Medal of Honor recipient. Then you get a lot of that. And that's why in the past, when I was there for 75th anniversary, when I was there for 80th anniversary, we would go here. The only problem is that when I'm there, like with the bus tour, we can't go in. We're restricted from going in. And it's because the story of visiting the Hawaiian Islands is a story for historical purposes. It's a story that's more about what you can't do than what you can do. Because what they want to do is they want to send you to the harbor, they want to let you have a slow drive-by experience at Punch Bowl Cemetery. And other than that, life has gone on, and a lot of people live on that island today, and the military still has a lot of territory and property on that island. And if you don't have military ID, a lot of what you've seen in this presentation, you don't get to visit. So, it's still possible to go there and have, I think, a meaningful commemoration of what happened 84 years ago today. Because, after all, so long as you don't go with one of the commercial tour operators, you can cap off your experience by going to Punch Bowl and visiting somebody like this guy, whoever he was, or this person, whoever he was. We don't know who he was, but we do know that he was on USS Arizona because that's where his body was found.
You said this is run by the Parks Department. Why can't they set it up like Arlington where you pay a fee, you walk around, they do have services going on, and they only have their shuttle where they drop you off? Why don't they do that here?
The short answer I have is that I think it's mixed up because two bureaucracies come together at one place at Punch Bowl, and that's the National Cemetery System and the American Battle Monuments Commission. And that's the U.S. commission that maintains our overseas cemeteries. When those two commissions, those two bureaucracies come together, I have found that their answer to everything is to introduce restrictions rather than, I find that they're not really guided by a sense of, you know what, we want to make this place available to everybody no matter what their use is. And I get their perspective because the last time I was here, it happened to me in a way, and that is that I went up to the Honolulu Memorial, right up there underneath the statue from the beginning of Hawaii Five-0, and there's a big beautiful fountain there. Maybe if you've been there, this big beautiful fountain sits right in front of her. And so I'm standing there at the fountain, and a family got out of their car and rushed up, and they had 5 kids with them, and all 5 of the kids ran ahead of the parents, ran straight to the fountain, and climbed into the fountain and started to splash around. And the cranky old man in me was like, somebody needs to teach these kids respect. And since that time, I've cooled off of that reaction because I'm like, hey, they were there. And kids are going to do what kids do. Let kids do kid stuff, let adults do adult stuff. And the fact that they were being a little bit, their behavior wasn't 100% perfect for a cemetery setting by adult standards, all I can think now is like, I'm just glad that they took them there. And I hope that they maybe corralled the behavior a little bit, but I'm glad that they went to that cemetery to remember it. And I can see why the National Cemetery quality and the ABMC monument quality, they come together and their reaction is more and more at these sites, If you go out to Arizona Memorial, you have to go to, they corral you into a theater. Has anybody done the Arizona Memorial? You get corralled into the theater, and you sit down for the theater, and part of what the theater does is it goes, here's the history that you're about to see. And it's explaining it to people that probably never heard of Pearl Harbor, which is kind of funny. But then it also has a little add-on that's code of conduct. And more I'm seeing those additions being a part of the experience here, where they are more and more going like, hey, where you are, this very tragic and violent action took place. It was a long time ago. It's maybe remote to your lived experience, but something tragic and horrible happened here, and a reverent burying at this location would probably be the more appropriate course of action. They are more and more scolding people to behave with reverence. And I think part of me wants to be the cranky old man that goes, these kids these days, they just don't get it. But then part of me also wants to go, this is a natural process of the passage of time. As we get farther and farther away from this event, I mean, it was 84 years ago. As we get farther and farther away from the event, it doesn't mean as much to as many people. And with each passing year, the people that it meant something to, they're going away. And what that means is that the people are left like us. It's incumbent on us to remember him and what happened to him 84 years ago today. It's important for us to remember December 7th, which is why we all came out on a rainy Sunday afternoon. And I thank you for coming. If you had any questions, we can talk about questions. Yes, sir.
So it's been a while since I read this, but the things that the Japanese didn't do that they could have done, could have crippled us for many, many more years.
I'm so glad this came up because I know what you're going to say.
No, I'm
I don't want to
asking
put,
you.
I don't want to
Go
put,
food for me.
yeah, I don't want to put words in your mouth. People tend to call attention to the fact that they didn't strike fuel storage,
Right.
that they didn't attack repair facilities, and and then they did attack the submarine base.
A submarine.
Yeah. And so I remember it's been 15 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, that there was an email that went around that was this email that described how Nimitz entered Pearl Harbor right before he took over from Husband Kimmel, and that Nimitz said, they're fools because they didn't do this, they didn't do that. Well, every one of those categories, fuel storage, repair facilities, submarine, they attacked all three of them.
They did.
All three of them. They just didn't get everything. And you might remember at the outset of the presentation, I said that the Japanese had trained for Lahaina roads, and then they trained for Pearl Harbor too, but they were less well prepared for Pearl Harbor. And so when they got there, what they did do, they did as much as they possibly could. And there's a reason why, by the time that the second wave was working through potential targets, there's a reason why they're not raking over the fuel storage the way that they could have. And that's because we were slapping them hard at that point. So 29 aircraft failed to return to the carriers that day. 26 of the 29 are shot down from the second wave. That, I think, tells you a very powerful thing about what was happening to the second wave. And that is the second wave had something to worry about that the first wave basically didn't have to worry about. And that was very effective American opposition. And so their attack on fuel storage, famously, I don't have it in the presentation, but there's this great photo that shows fuel storage, and it was right next to the sub base. And the fuel storage tanks, all above ground tanks, they were basically undamaged. There were a couple of aircraft, dive bombers from second wave that dropped bombs in that area, but they didn't connect and didn't get direct hits. And there's a reason why they didn't get good hits on fuel storage, and that's because when they lined up for their attack, they came in at about 5,000 feet, they lined up on it, and then they nosed over because the Japanese P-3A-1 Val dive bomber is a dive bomber, and as they nosed over, so much anti-aircraft fire came up at them that they all dropped way sooner than they should have, because dive bombers, no matter what country they're from in World War II, they're usually only on target if they release at about 1,000 feet. And these guys, we believe that at 5,000, they nosed over, they released at about 3,000, and nobody could score accurate hits during World War II with a release from 3,000 feet. And they released at 3,000 because they didn't like getting shot at. And there was a lot of that going on. Yeah, good reason to release. And that's part of the reason why they have no accuracy. Now, for repair facilities, let me find the photo. In fact, that's why it ends up becoming a little bit almost comical when, let me just show you the photo, because it's the real famous photo of USS Shaw when it went high order at about, I think that's at about 8:06 a.m. And Shaw is sitting here in YFD2, which is a floating dry dock, which is a repair facility. It's sitting next to, you know what, I don't have it in the presentation, but there's a famous series of photos of Cassin Downs in Pennsylvania and dry dock number 1 at the Navy base, and they're all ravaged. And they're ravaged from the fact that the Japanese, first of all, a torpedo struck the gate for dry dock number 1, and it detonated, but it didn't blow the gate open. And they were trying to blow the gate open and flood the dry dock and destroy it. There are 3 ships in the dry dock, Pennsylvania, Cassin, and Downs. And then when they didn't manage to flood it, they then came in and bombed all 3 ships, made havoc of Cassin and Downs. And then eventually, the torpedo hit to the gates of the dry dock. They eventually gave way after the attack, and the dry dock flooded. And so that's a repair facility that gets attacked and destroyed. There's a reason why they have a couple of aircraft that fly over the submarine base that get shot down on the first wave, and there's a reason why they stay away from the submarine base. And it was because Patrol Squadron number 1, you know the American PT boat, 78-foot long patrol torpedo boat like President Kennedy operated in the war. Patrol Squadron number 1 was being embarked aboard ship for transportation to Midway the following week. So that the PT boats, where there was a PT tender, a patrol boat tender, and the PT boats had been loaded onto the tender. And so the crews of each of the PT boats, they're still living on their PT boats, even though they're piggybacked on top of a tender. And when the attack began, they're all right there, and they already had the ammunition that they were taking with them to Midway the following week. And so they immediately swing into action, and even though they're nested on top of, piggyback on top of the tender, the PT boat guys open fire. And if you've not seen photos of what armed PT boats, they were nothing but muscle. They were nothing but armament. And in each case, there were 4 PT boats from Patrol Squadron number 1 that were on one tender, and the crewmen ran to the forward part of the boat. The bow terminated at, it was the Navy Mark 17 twin 50 caliber machine gun mount. And so there were 4 boats. They all had twin 50 caliber machine gun mounts right at the bow. And all of the operators crawled on board those guns and opened fire during the first wave. And in fact, what we believe now is that the attack on USS California was basically ruined by one of the PT boats, where this, I can't remember the guy's name now, he's long since dead, but he climbed into his twin gun mount, and he said, I didn't even have to move to get one after the other because they kept flying into my gun sight. Wow. And that was because where he was on a tender looking straight south, looking straight down Battleship Row, from the subbase, right next to the subbase, as the torpedo bombers that were attacking California rolled in, he just burned one after the other. And there's famously one of them gets shot down in the harbor by this guy, and he damages several others, and that's what causes the initial wave of torpedo bombers on Battleship Row to break off and circle back around Honolulu and come in for a second attack. Which leads them to all kinds of headaches in the way that they played out the attack. The first wave was supposed to be this very well-coordinated, simultaneous attack on every base, and it was everything except that. Everything went off at different times. Nobody mutually supported one another, and there are several moments where that first formation of torpedo bombers lining up on California, the 5th aircraft, he would later testify in his after-action report that all 4 of the aircraft in front of him just exploded and either banked off or crashed into the harbor, and it led him to then pull away and try to cheat further to the south. And as he did so, he said that he had to bank up and nose up all of a sudden because 3 dive bombers flew directly in front of him. And it was because they didn't have this proper separation between attacking elements that they would have had if everything had gone off according to the plan, which it didn't. And part of the reason that they end up later in first wave and then almost entirely during second wave, they stay away from the subbase, is because that's where Patrol Torpedo Squadron 1 is on board a tender, and there was a lot of fire coming from down there, and they stayed away from it. The dive bombers crept in just far enough to go, I don't like this, I'm going to drop and get out of here. And they dropped too high to be accurate. But they tried to drop on the fuel storage. And you know what the fuel storage attack situation leads us to decide? And that is, you know what it's called, the Salt Lake. If you know where the stadium is down there today, what is that called, the Aloha Bowl or whatever it is? That's where they have the Aloha Bowl. There's a big stadium down there today, and that's built near Salt Lake, and there is this cavernous underground fuel storage facility there that has been in the news the last few years because it's all freshwater storage and fuel storage for the harbor, because you know it's now one big base. It's now called Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, and it's the Navy and the Air Force together maintaining one big base. And all fuel storage and freshwater for Joint Reserve Base Pearl Harbor Hickam was at Salt Lake, and they were trying to clean out fresh water storage 5 or maybe 6 years ago, and someone accidentally ran jet fuel into fresh water storage pipes, and it contaminated everything. And the result was then that the last time, well, when we were there, when we were on Hickam, because we got on Hickam and we were exploring around, and there were Hawaii National Guard potable water decontamination units on Hickam trying to make the water drinkable. And I don't mean this to make it sound like the sky is falling, but the bigger problem that it created was this contamination of the Salt Lake underground fuel and water storage facility. Was that, and you'll still see it if anybody goes to Hawaii anytime soon, you'll see these big U.S. Navy forward deployment reprovisioning ships that sit off the harbor now, because that's where all the fuel is. Because they can't use Salt Lake right now because of this hazardous waste mitigation project. So all of the fuel for all of the jets that come and go from Hickam sits on ships right off the harbor entrance, which to me that's a little bit of a chilling thing to think about.
Yeah.
If we end up going to war, that would be a bad thing. Sir?
Do you have any other presentations coming up? I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming, and thanks for saying that. We don't have anything on the books, but maybe
But we
should
will
do something.
probably plan some things, for the next coming year. So.
Yeah. I do a lot on this sort of thing, but also check out TV. I'm on History Channel on 8 different shows on the History Channel, so keep watching for that. Any other people? Steve Jervy, yes sir.
Question about Niihau. I know you didn't address it in this, but there was a Navy pilot, a Japanese pilot, that did wind up going there.
Yep.
And is it my understanding that partially because of that incident on Niihau, that the internment camps were considered by Roosevelt in California? Is that correct?
That is correct. 20-year-old Shigenori Nishikaichi was a pilot on Kaga. One of the things that has emerged in the last 20 years, which is why I think this subject is something that's still worth studying, and that is that I get this a lot. I never used to get this until like the last 5 or 6 years, but I get a lot of people like, why should we still talk about World War II? Well, you've just asked the $1 million question that answers that question, and that is, so 20-year-old Petty Officer Shigenori Nishikaichi, a Zero pilot from the Japanese aircraft carrier Kaga. He sustains damage second wave over Bellows Army Airfield, which is on the windward coast. And because he gets hit and he knows, he at first flies north like he's going to try to make it back to the fleet. And we know that he got up north to Kahuku and that he looked at gauges and he went, I am not going to make it. And then he then turned west. And we know that he turned west because 1 billion people on the ground saw him do it. Goto and Michichi shot down off of Barbers Point. They were trying to get to Niihau too. That's where they were going. Because Niihau, if you know the Hawaiian Islands, Niihau is the one that's farthest to the west of what we recognize now as the main Hawaiian archipelago. I mean, the archipelago stretches all the way to Midway. Technically, Midway is part of the Hawaiian Islands, but sitting 18 miles south of Kauai is, here I can show you on this map, is the island Nihihau. Well, I can pull it up. Nope, that's not it. I want to go to this other.
And I can probably get you onto Nihihau, but it's not going to be cheap.
Helicopter, right?
Get us over the Midway, Fish and Wildlife Service, closed down.
Midway is getting harder and harder.
It's basically a private
Yeah,
island, so.
I thought I had a good map showing you where it was, but I don't think I had a map showing.
Well, there's my Hawaiian archipelago.
Oh yeah, let's use Jennifer's map. That's perfect. So, because it'll be on there. Nihihau, right there, right next to Kauai. So, Nishikaiichi, with damage, he's flying initially north. He gets to Kahuku, realizes I'm not going to make it, and he makes the 125-mile run to Nihihau. And we know that he overflies the island because at first he was confused. He had been told that it was an uninhabited island, and he overflies it because he sees people coming out of church. Because if you think of the timing, he's second wave, it's probably getting close to 10. They have just gotten out of church, and he sees 100 people coming out of a church. And he overflies the island. No, that's not it. And then he's got nothing but open ocean in front of him. And he turns back to Nihihau, comes in from this direction. The southern part of Nihihau was designated as the emergency auxiliary landing field for all of the aircraft participating in this attack. And it's because there are 2 dry lake beds on there. They're not always dry lake beds, but 90% of the time every year they're dry lake beds. And they're nice and smooth and flat, and you can land an airplane there. And so the Japanese planned that that would be used as the auxiliary airfield in the event that somebody gets damaged and can't make it back to the fleet. And the plan furthermore imagined that if you put your airplane down on one of the dry lake beds, then go to the beach on the windward side of the island, which would be the eastern side, and then stake out on the beach. A submarine will come and pick you up, which is exactly what happened. The submarine showed up, but when the submarine showed up, there's nobody on the beach, and the submarine sailed off. And the reason that there was nobody on the beach is that by the point that the submarine got there, Shigenori Nishikaiichi was dead. And if you're not familiar with the story, what ends up happening on Nihihau is that Nishikaiichi ditches his airplane in the right around noon on December 7th, and he ditches himself right in the front yard of a Hawaiian living on the island, and knocks himself unconscious. In so doing, this Hawaiian comes out, helps him, takes him into town, and the town, for what it was a town for about 100 people. It's not a very big settlement, but on this island that is privately owned by the Robinson family, and it has been owned by the Robinsons since 1864. And the Robinsons continue to own all of Nihihau and more than half of Kauai. So the Robinsons ain't doing too bad. In fact, when I met Old Man Robinson, I walked away from it going, that might be the richest person I will ever meet. At any rate. And he walks around with like a construction helmet on and overalls and everything that he does. Anyway, when Nishikaiichi is taken up to the town, there is one of the people living on the island was of Japanese ancestry, and he could speak Japanese. He spoke to Nishikaiichi. The intrigues begin. The Hawaiians don't understand what the 2 Japanese are saying to this pilot. At first, Nishikaiichi says, "Oh, I just got lost on a transition." Then eventually they start to figure out that something's going on, because from Nihihau, every night at sunset, they could look toward Kauai and they could see lights on the coast. And they could turn on the radio and listen to broadcasts from Honolulu. Well, on the night of Sunday, December 7th, when they looked toward Kauai, it's completely blacked out. And then they turned on the radio and there was nothing. And that's when they figured out there's something going on here. And it probably relates to this Japanese pilot that just showed up here yesterday. And so they incarcerated him by locking him in a shed. He eventually then, with the assistance of this Japanese-speaking man named Yoshio Harada, who lived on Nihihau. Yoshio Harada is married to Irene Harada. And the Haradas then helped Nishikaiichi break out, because what Nishikaiichi wanted to do was to get to the site of the airplane that he had ditched and destroy it, because he had been told, if you ditch your airplane, you've got to destroy it. At this point, the Japanese Zero is a super secret weapon, and they didn't want it falling into our custody. And so we believe that Nishikaiichi convinced the Haradas to break him out so that he could go to his airplane and destroy it. Maybe that's all he wanted to do. He probably at that point had no ambition toward escaping from Nihihau, but he definitely wanted to get that airplane destroyed. Yoshio and Irene Harada helped him to do that. He eventually works his way up to the side of the airplane on December 9th. They set the airplane on fire and the airplane gets burned out, which if you've ever seen any of my photos of it, I've got photos of both before and after the airplane got burned. Then he was, when he landed in the front yard of a Hawaiian man named Hao Kaleohana. Kaleohana, when he ran onto the airplane after the airplane came to a grinding halt, Nishikaichi was initially unconscious, and he had a leg board. You know how pilots will have a leg board with some maps and some charts and some information, and he had his pistol. And when Hao Kaleohana ran onto the wing of the airplane, he looked in there, here's the pilot unconscious, and Kaleohana took his leg board and took his pistol. So that when Nishikaichi on December 9th goes to the side of the airplane where it crashed at the dry lake bed, burns the airplane with Yoshio Harada's assistance, he then wants to find Hao Kaleohana so that he can recover the knee board and the pistol. And he then goes around through the town sort of harassing and intimidating the people. At that point, the only firearm they had was a single-shot shotgun that was on the island for bird hunting, and Yoshio Harada was using that. Right before they burned the airplane, Nishikaichi took one of the machine guns out of the cowling of the airplane and carried that around, menacing everybody, even though the machine gun was electrically fired and he couldn't fire a single round with it. But still, it was a belt-fed machine gun, and he intimidated everybody with that as they tried to find Kaleohana, the leg board, and the pistol, which they never found, by the way, which, when I had my audience with Old Man Robinson, I asked him about that, and he looked at me and he went, "Thank you so much for coming. I had a great time." And I was like, yeah, because I want to know where that pistol is. And I'm pretty sure it's in his drawer in his bedroom. Yes.
There's a question from online here
Oh, is
for
there?
you. Yes.
What is it?
Are there any is there any surviving wreckage from the USS Arizona on Ford Island? So.
Yeah, there's a lot of wreckage from USS Arizona. First and foremost, there's the destroyed remnants of the ship that are in place right off Ford Island. Inside the Pacific Aviation Museum on Ford Island, which is now known as the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum. There are pieces of wreckage there, but then also at Iroquois Point on the west side of the harbor, they took everything that was superstructure above the water level, cut it all off, and dumped it there. It's all still sitting there to this day.
Pearl Ridge,
What's that?
Pearl Ridge, Pearl City, that area.
Yeah. But back to your original question real quick, and that is that in the aftermath of the Niihau incident, eventually Nishikaichi gets killed. He gets killed by a Hawaiian on the island. And after his death, then eventually they go there. Hao Kaleohana, he provides some evidence about what happened. Yoshio Harada, the man that was helping Nishikaichi, he committed suicide right after Nishikaichi gets killed. Irene Harada, his wife, survives, is taken into FBI custody. She's taken to Honolulu. She's interned at Honolulu until the end of the war and then deported. And her interrogation report remains classified until 2027. So no one has ever seen her interrogation report. And we believe that it was on the basis of the Niihau incident that the president was eventually convinced to sign Executive Order of 1966. So I got to stay alive for at least 2 more years so I can read that report. Irene Harada, she's dead now, but she survived until like 5 years ago. And she went back to, when she got deported at the end of the war, she went back to Japan, and she was sort of unreconstructed throughout all of it. She's very bitter about being locked up by the U.S. for the rest of the Second World War. And she made apparently only one other trip to Niihau. But we think in the Niihau example, the incident provided the major groundwork for what led to internment. There were a bunch of things that happened on the West Coast as well, so that as what often gets depicted is that the president's decision to authorize internment is often depicted as something that he did with absolutely no good reason. I'm not saying that he had good reason, but I am saying that he had reasons. There were multiple reasons. The Niihau incident, a number of incidents that occurred in California, but that's a subject for another presentation for another day. So thanks for the questions. Yes, sir, in the back.
Operation Z,
Yes, Operation Z, one of my favorite subjects.
is that really what it was called? Was that really the working title?
No, the Japanese didn't call it that.
Did we call it that?
We called it that.
Okay.
And it's called that colloquially to this day, and that was the second attack on Pearl Harbor. Everybody's heard of that, right? March 1942, second attack on Pearl Harbor. And the second attack on Pearl Harbor, it consists of 2 Japanese H-8K float planes. The H-8K is this big 4-engine seaplane that the Japanese operated, and 2 aircraft flew from Woja in the Marshall Islands. They flew first to not Hawaii directly, but they flew to an area called French Frigate Shoals that is 450 miles to the west of Honolulu, where they rendezvoused with a Japanese submarine that fueled them. So it was a 1,700-mile flight from Woja to French Frigate Shoals. They took fuel at French Frigate Shoals, and then they flew on from there to Honolulu to bomb it, to go back to your question. Because this operation, this special operation, was planned entirely to destroy repair facilities, which by March 1942 were being used to recover warships that had been destroyed in the attack, or warships that we thought were completely destroyed in the attack, which were not destroyed at all. As an example, battleship USS Nevada, heavily damaged during first and second wave, brought back to good health, and Nevada's offshore on Tuesday, June 6, 1944, shelling German positions during the D-Day invasion. And so the Japanese were, by this point, we believe, a spy network that was still present on the island even after Pearl Harbor, even after the attack. We believe that the spies were getting information out that the Americans are recovering all these ships and repairing these ships. And so they staged this operation to come back in an attempt to destroy the repair facilities.
What happened?
They don't hit a thing. The only thing they hit is this hillside directly above Theodore Roosevelt High School. And if you ever go to Punch Bowl, the approach road is Angeles, and the